Now, on to our first speaker this morning. Peter van der Vliet is a physiotherapist by training, and 25 years ago he got involved in Paralympic sport, first at the local, then at the national, and then at the international level. And since 2006, he has been head of medical and scientific division at the International Paralympic Committee. Delighted to introduce you to Dr. Peter van der Vliet.
Good morning, everybody, and I would like to thank the organizers for getting me here on stage. It's quite of an impressive view from here. It was an impressive view yesterday. I'm glad I show up that small, and I hope that my slides speak for it. And I need to give a disclosure. I have not tweeted yet. I apologize for that. Good. London 2012. It's great to be back in London. I've been here before. It's great to be back in Excel, which was one of the venues where we had powerlifting, table tennis, judo, boccia, and sitting volleyball. And it's great to be back in this particular room where 7 months ago our powerlifters were setting world performances. That's just as a snapshot. London for the Paralympic Games were the biggest games ever. 4,300 athletes, 164 nations. 15 nations showed up in London who were never at any Paralympic Games before. And that's thanks to the incentives that London and the UK government gave for them to participate. We have 20 sports on the program, 251 world records, which say something about the performance level and the room for improvement that we still have within the Paralympic environment. 314 Paralympic Games records on a 4-year cycle, and then a whole series of new domestic and international heroes. Names like Ellie Simmons, David Ware, Johnny Peacock, they become Sarah Story, they become household names in the UK. Internationally, we have Alan Frontera who beat Oscar Pistorius. We have Esther Feguer who won her 400 wheelchair tennis game in a row. There's plenty of names we can come up with. We have Alex Senardi, the previous Formula 1 racer, who won the Brands Hatch road hand cycling races on a circuit where he used to be a Formula 1 racer about 10-15 years ago. 1.1 million tickets got sold 1 year ahead of the Games. This only happens in a crazy sport nation like the UK. In total, out of 3 million tickets, 2.7 million got sold. Never ever we had that before. We had a full Olympic park, an amazing atmosphere, and much of that, very much of that, was due to an impressive volume and enthusiasm of games makers. There they are. They did a marvelous job to make it happen in an overall crazy sport country. Of course, we do have some advantage that we had a smaller event preceding the Paralympic Games. We name it the Olympics. This all comes back. Our journey started in 1948. Coincidentally, on the date of the opening ceremony of the London Olympic Games. Sir Ludwig Goodman, who was the head surgeon in Stoke Mandeville, decided at that moment in time to host an international competition with inviting Dutch veterans to have an archery competition in the grounds of Stoke Mandeville Hospital as part of the rehabilitation program. As of today, we identify this moment in time as the birthday of the Paralympic game, of the Paralympic movement. And it was great to be back last year and celebrate this anniversary here in London. From 1948 onwards, up to today, we had a steep journey. And today, the mission and the aspiration of our movement is to build a bridge in society and increase social awareness. Sports as a vehicle, sports as a tool to make societal change. And this is where our Paralympic athletes became, in the lead up to London, the ambassadors. We never had that before, that Paralympic athletes were in the media and were on the adverts so much in advance to build that momentum. And London kept that momentum after the Games. Some statistics. after the games, about a month after the games were finished, 50% of the people interviewed said that the Paralympic Games were more inspirational than the Olympic Games. I'm not going to say no, but I'll leave that to you. 85% were convinced that these people were an aspiration to look into. And much of that was also due to bringing Paralympic experts into the TV studios, that they could talk from the inside of the movement, and it helped to explain how the rules of the sport are played and what Paralympic sport is about. 2 quotes, one from the British Prime Minister David Cameron. "My best moment was putting that gold medal around the neck of Ellie Simmonds. When I used to push my son even around in his wheelchair, I always thought that people saw the wheelchair, not the boy. Today, more people would see the boy and not the wheelchair. And that's because what happened over here this summer." And another one from Lord Sepp Coe, the chairman of the organizing committee. "Our minds were opened to what people can do and what can be achieved by sheer talent and determination." These quotes say more than 1,000 words. Now, how does David Cameron and Lord Sepp Coe link up to me? I had a minor role in these preparations as the head of the medical department of the International Paralympic Committee. I'm supervising and monitoring the implementation of medical services, the anti-doping program, classification, and I'm sure nobody wants to know anything about that one, and sports science. I'm not going to tell about the success of our anti-doping program and how we caught 2 athletes with growth hormone. I'm not going to take 5 days of your life by introducing you to classification, neither on sports science. But I'm going to expand for the next time being a little bit on what the medical services mean for Paralympic athletes. And we were in an absolute unique situation here in London, well served by the Polyclinic, which is the jewel of the crown of medical services. That's the building you see, the big building, the triangle one, which is in the heart of the athlete village. In the session following on this one, we have the lead persons of the Polyclinic services who will expand on how they build up the services. But never ever in our life we were treated on that service level. Much due to the way LOCOC, the organizing committee, implemented the medical services and the medical department, and Pam Venning next session will certainly expand on these ones. But what was amazing from our perspective is that they had Paralympic integration from day one all the way through. My first meetings with Richard and Pam date from 6 years ahead of the Games. And they only spoke one language. It was Olympic and Paralympic Games. That means that whatever service level was put in place, our statement is, if it works for the Paralympics, it works for the Olympics. Not necessarily the way around. When you look at accessibility, when you look at certain service levels that are required for the particular needs of Paralympic athletes. So they took that momentum and they built on that one and they made it happen in the 6 years of preparations and the 60 days of delivery, because that's ultimately what the relationship and the ratio is. 15,000 medical encounters were registered from the opening of the Paralympic Village up to the closing. 1/3 of these is athletes. Now, athletes are the core of the Games, but if you see these numbers, then you know that what service level needs to be put in place goes far beyond the service level only to be put in place for the athletes. You do have your workforce, you do have your officials, you do have your dignitaries and your Olympic and Paralympic family, and you have the millions and millions of spectators. And they all fall back on the same medical services team, which is led by very key players, certainly within the UK. Peak registrations on a daily basis is over 1,000 visits to the medical service centres, either at the venue, either at the polyclinic. That's a massive volume to deal with in what mainly are provisional settings. If you look at the venues, many of these venues were temporary facilities, and you need to build them up and scope for that volume of work within that small time frame. Now, Paralympic athletes are athletes at first. And that means that through the course of your medical services, you run into a whole series of clinical manifestations who are due to the nature of sport. Now, our constituency brings some particular challenges. They're either visual impaired, they're either wheelchair users. There is an underestimation or a not sufficient understanding on our CP athletes and coordination impairment. And we have the whole register of amputees and athletes with lower limb deficiencies. Particularly, our athletes require some care when it comes to skin because of loss of sensitivity. And when you combine that with a wet environment, then you know that this is something that Paralympic athletes might be more vulnerable to than any of our Olympic counterparts we may have. You need to train the medical staff on extrication, how to safely remove the athlete from his sport equipment, be it a prosthesis, be it a wheelchair, or in winter sports, be it the sit ski. We need to do rehearsal plans. We work through these plans. That's also the value of test events in the year before. We run exercises, local run exercises with staff and volunteers being qualified as Paralympians, and then they run A, B, and C, or gold, silver, and bronze training exercise, all to familiarize themselves with how to do an expedited assessment on the athlete while being on the field of play. And we do have very particular provisions to be looked at for thermoregulation, either in the extreme cold environment, which is in our winter sports. You may know winter sports typically have a borderline, a limit of minus 25 degrees. That's what they consider too cold to ski. Now, minus 25 for an able-bodied skier or for a Paralympic athlete who has no sensation in the lower limbs makes a slight difference. How do you capture with these? Are these the right boundaries? We have that to explore that more in full. But the same applies also to the extreme heat environment, hot environments. Not like we have beach volleyball, which is typically in very hot and humid, exotic places. A tennis court is very hot and humid as well, protected from wind chill. And there is an exposure of these athletes who already have a deviant thermoregulation by the nature of their impairment. We know already for about 10 to 15 years that one of the major concerns we have with wheelchair racing athletes, due to the repetitive nature of propulsion, is shoulder impingement syndromes. So this is what coaches and athletes try to be sensitive to and alternate their training volume. But what we all need to be aware of, and what we not necessarily know in full, is what is the impact on the post-career of those athletes. The day that David Weir retires from wheelchair racing, he still is wheelchair bound, and he still needs his wheelchair for daily activity. Now, if he has been exposed to wrong or repetitive strains in the shoulder, then it becomes quite a challenge to reach to all the medals and all the cups that he won, and he wants to show them to his grandchildren afterwards. The same applies to prosthetic users. The repetitive impact of the stump and the shaft of the prosthesis is something which is slightly unknown, and what the impact means on the post-career of those athletes. For that reason, again, London first, we initiated an illness and injury survey on Paralympic Games. We did it already during Winter Games for some time, and I'll briefly tell the importance of that one afterwards. But if we don't try to systematically capture the nature of injury and illness, we will not be able to formulate advice and give recommendations on how to avoid that in future. And what we set up is a systematic survey with the athletes through the team physicians and the local medical services. And we try to complement the findings on injury with the footage of broadcasting so that we can look into what is the dynamics of the activity, what happened in the seconds before an injury happened, Are we able to find that in our TV footage? Are we able to find that on video somewhere so that we can learn? Was it a human error? Is it a mechanical deficiency? Is it the nature of the slope or the environment? Yep. It's only when we get the full spectrum that we can understand what kind of service and how we can improve our service level. We had an absolutely great compliance. All except 4 nations participated voluntarily to this study. That means that also at their end there is an understanding of the need for this kind of activity. If you look at the injury rates expressed in 1,000 athlete days, then we see that our injury rates are not significantly different from those during any other major event. Similar surveys are done during Olympic Games, FIFA World Cup, athletics international competitions, ice hockey competitions. So they're all in the same rate. However, we do have some particularities. If you look at the left-hand side, this is the top 5 of injuries reported by athletes. And about 50% of them are acute injuries that happen during the event without having a pre-existing condition or without having an underlying condition. And then we see that shoulder and wrist and hand injuries are the most common reported during the Paralympic Games. Not surprisingly, knowing that 1/4 of our athletes are wheelchair bound, not surprising that many of them also have a wrist and hand by using crutches complementary to their sporting activities. On the illness side, on the right-hand side, the majority of consultations the athletes went through in London was for respiratory system. It's the typical cough. Not sure that we can complain the UK climate or the London climate for that one, because we had amazing days. We had no single drop of rain from the opening to the closing ceremony. I think that has been a unicum in the UK as well. Second biggest illness reported is skin-related problems. And then you see on number 5, urinary system problems. This is typical to a wheelchair-bound population. It's the urinary tract problem. And this is by pushing their limits in wheelchair-bound athletes. Now, these data are just last week accepted for publication. They're published in the British Journal of Sport Medicine. So those who have an interest to further explore these data, please do so. And above all, tweet me your feedback. Yeah? What we are going to do now in the next weeks and in the next months is we are going to analyze these data by impairment group and by sport, so that we are in a position to give advice to team physicians, athletes, coaches, but also to future organizing committees on where they can tailor the level of care in their operations and in their preparations. As I said, we did this kind of a survey already for 3 games in a row during the Winter Games. We started this study in Salt Lake, and in Salt Lake, in the sport of ice sledge hockey, we encountered a significant number of acute trauma in the lower limbs. Fractures of the ankle or the tibia and the fibula shaft. And looking at these data systematically and also looking on what happened on the field of play, we found that they were mainly due to the absence of protection of the lower limbs in a sport that is known to be quite impactful, be it to the opponent, be it to the boardings. So we gave recommendations to the sport and said, you need to put a calf shaft, like football players, and you need to build an absorption ring on the front of your sledges, so that the impact is not immediately from leg to leg or from boarding to leg. The outcome in 2010 is that we did not have any single acute lower limb trauma during the games. And it's only by having a systematic record of these data that we can advise the sport accordingly, and this work is now ongoing. Something that caught particular attention of the media in the lead-up to the Paralympic Games was boosting. All of a sudden, this was the doping of the Paralympic sport. This was the cheating of Paralympic athletes in absence of anything better. But it gave our media department and myself hands full in the final weeks before London. The mechanism might be known to you. It occurs in individuals with high spinal cord injury, typically tetraplegics, that when you have a trigger or a stimulus that causes pain or discomfort below the lesion level, the response from the cortex is deviated to the cardiac system, leads to hypertension, and it is recorded already through the 90s that in a road race where athletes were induced autonomic dysreflexia, that it leads to a 10% performance increase. Now, we are aware of this issue, and we could counter a little bit what the media was making out of it, but we know that some athletes will attempt to clamp their bladder, sit on something sharp, or push with needles and pins on their skin to evoke such a stimulus. We have a monitoring process in place, and also here the whole procedure or policy and the findings so far just got accepted for publication in the British Journal of Sport Medicine. We use the indirect measure of systolic blood pressure as an indicator for boosting. That means any athlete who reports to the call room, that means in the last half an hour to an hour before competition, and has, when we do a blood pressure check, has a systolic blood pressure of 180 or plus, we know this is very unusual for a tetraplegic. And that means that something's going on. Either this is an individual who's trying to bypass our rules and regulations and voluntarily induce autonomic dysreflexia, which is not allowed. Either this is an individual with a history of hypertension, and then it must be recorded. If that one is not recorded through the team physician, then we remove the athlete for health reasons from that event. And that is known, the athletes know that. We did the survey. Our data today show an average systolic blood pressure of 135 across the board. But we had athletes going to 175. We are now revisiting that policy and trying to find alternative ways to monitor whether or not they're voluntarily inducing autonomic dysreflexia. And again, just tweet me your input. What the individuals, in a survey that we did 2008 to 2010, what the individuals, the athletes, however, are not aware of is that boosting as such is a very dangerous, life-threatening, or may become a very dangerous and life-threatening condition. And that is where we now, next to doing the assessment and the testing, are building an educational strategy. I'm not going to expand on where we go with technology, but clearly London showed us that this is in the media. We had an absolutely marvelous 200 meters final with Oscar Pistorius beaten by Alan Fronteira, a young Brazilian athlete. It caused some concern in the media because Oscar went out with the statement that the blades were too long. It took me 48 hours of my time of sleep to respond to all the media queries. We have revised the rules, we changed the rules, and next World Championship in Lyon this summer is the last one where the athletes will run with blade lengths as we have currently being the standard. We are looking into the whole attention it gave. It requires now the organization, the movement with all the sports involved to look into more detail in the technology that athletes bring to the field of play. We are hosting an international conference on technology and equipment in Paralympic sport next week in Bonn, where our headquarters is based. And from there will be initiatives taken and requirements put forward to all the sports to properly rule and regulate equipment provisions. We are not going to not allow developments to happen, but we have a policy in place that it needs to be standardized, it needs to be safe to the athlete, safe to the opponent, but also without irreversible damage to the field of play. And the parts of which equipment are made up need to be universally available. It's not helpful to develop sport in the long term that high-tech equipment only comes available to few sponsored athletes. That makes these events and these competitions not vulnerable on the long term. The sports need to reflect upon a policy that we can have more athletes from more regions in the world, from more countries in the world, access to good material that allows for a fair competition. And ultimately, there will be then a big event coming and an absolutely high-tech profile at the Games. But we need to build it from the foundations. Let me summarize with a few quotes. Again, British Journal of Sport Medicine just released a thematic issue on Olympic and Paralympic Games research. And there's some very nice editorials written to that special issue. And a few quotes from there. The priority at Olympic and Paralympic Games is protecting the health of the athletes. The demands of the athletes are particularly great because of the unique nature and the pressure of the Games. Again, London did an absolutely great thing by certification, by building in certification for sport medicine expertise. It wasn't existing before London won the bid for the Games. Now you have that certification in the country, and it allowed the medical services department also to build in particular expertise that is sport related. It's a specialty in its own right, and perhaps the next step is sport medicine for Paralympic athletes. The key to providing healthcare is the integration into all other functional areas of the organization. Medical services is available to everybody who in one way or another want to join, feel, sense, smell and taste the Games. Your athletes first, but you have to take care of your workforce. They go into 60 days of massive workload. You have to take care of your games makers who make it happen. You have to take care of your spectators and your visitors. The field of play is the goldfish bowl where the initial response of the medical team will be judged by millions of armchair critics. It's primary seating that you all have to see what goes on the field of play. And the field of play management on medical care is a very complicated interaction between the organizing committee, the IF, and the team physicians. All have a role to play. Rules within every sport might be different on who makes the final call. Some sports do have provisions in place that if an athlete suffers some concussion, there's a 40-hour rule not playing. Some sports don't have provisions at all. You need to work all these things out, but know that whatever you do on the field of play will be judged by millions. And the polyclinic is the jewel of the crown when 90% of the athlete care is carried out. But moreover, it protects the national health services from being overburdened by the demands of athletes, support staff, and Olympic, Paralympic family. If you read the report of the National Health Services following the Games, London did an exceptional task. If you don't put special provisions in place, tailored through the polyclinic, you risk indeed that with all these thousands of people that visit and are available during the Games, they will all run into your emergency units of your regular community hospitals. They're not provided to that. So you do need to invest significant time and resources on how that polyclinic is able to capture that volume, knowing that you set it up for 60 days. So you need to define proper legacy plans on that one too. The more than 4,000 Paralympic athletes living together in the village were provided an exceptional service. That's no rocket science, but planning and consideration to the needs of all. And that's perhaps the key learning. It's 6 or 7 years of planning for 60 days of delivery, and then the game is over. Despite of the thousands of consultations with the athletes in the polyclinic, more than half of the athlete care actually takes place within their own medical team. And that's a key learning for all of us. And it prompts us to invest on a daily basis more in our interaction and relationship with the team physicians. Now, It is interesting for you to know that during Olympic Games, 1/3 of the delegations is traveling without a team physician. That means that they rely fully on the services level which is put in place by the organizing committee. And similarly, during Paralympic Games, smaller sizes of delegations, less professional qualifications on the national level, half of the delegations are traveling without their own team physician. You need to scope for that, and you need to be prepared to capture that one. Having said that, London was a unique success, and I still haven't had time to properly capture all the sensations and the inputs that I got. But I'm not the only one. I heard there's still people running around in London wearing a games maker uniform. So I think I said enough for today. I want to close here with a small video that gives you an impression on Paralympic sport, and I thank you for joining me at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning.
In this country, we will never think of sport the same way, and we will never think of disability the same way.
These have been, quite simply, amazing Paralympic Games.
London 2012, made in Britain.
Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for that fantastically inspiring talk. A couple of themes from our tweeters. On the clinical side, the importance of long-term thinking in clinical care, which I think came across very well, both in terms of the immediate and also the longer-term needs of these athletes. And then scenario planning doesn't happen enough in healthcare, and the idea that you have done, practiced things and thought ahead of the difficulties you might face. And from that, I wanted to ask a question that occurred to me. It seems to me that the people you've been dealing with are expert in their own needs, both as people with disability and as international athletes. And I wondered if you could give a sense of how that has made you think more about how we can mobilize and amplify patient expertise in their own needs and really bring them in as partners in the care that they receive in healthcare more generally.
there are easier questions to respond to. The main key learning is Paralympic athletes are athletes, and that means they require medical services to be put in place by specialists who know medical care but also know sport. And rather than, our background is in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, we were a medical care driven organization. Today we are a sports organization. And that means you need to have these sport experts that are providing this care to the athletes on a daily basis, building up and following up. They need to understand, they need to build a relationship with the coaches, with the athletes. The athletes typically know the best how their body functions. Yeah? So they need to go into dialogue with the athletes, understand these mechanics. And there is no one fit all strategy in Paralympic sport. That doesn't work. Every individual is unique. And that's how you need to build that capacity. And you only can do it through engaging yourself on a daily basis with those athletes.
Peter van der Vliet, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks.